Stewardesses, sky girls, air hostesses. Female flight attendants have gone by various titles over the last 9 decades. Women in this profession have been widely regarded as glamorous over the years, and most of us are probably familiar with the stereotypes of stewardesses being single, attractive young women who are the stuff of male fantasy. But have you ever wondered what took this profession that was initially full of highly trained professional nurses and reduced them down to nothing much more than sex symbols whose employers basically invited passengers to sexually harass in the hopes of selling more plane tickets? Take a journey with me and let's talk about it. Hey y'all, I'm Christina and you're listening to History and Hearsay. If you know a little about the history of aviation, you may know the name Ellen Church as the woman who became the first stewardess in 1930. But while Ellen was the first stewardess, she was actually not the first flight attendant. The first flight attendant was a German man named Heinrich Kubis. You see, male flight attendants came before female stewardesses, and it wasn't until the late 1970s that airlines actually ended up dropping the title of stewardess altogether for the more gender-neutral title of flight attendants to include both male and female employees. Kubis began his career as a flight attendant 18 years before Ellen Church. This was actually before any fixed-wing airliner was even large enough to carry a steward, and so he actually worked as a steward not on an airplane, but on a Zeppelin, which, if you're familiar with those, are basically giant blimps. Kubis started working for the German airline DLAG in March 1912 and served as chief steward in all future German passenger Zeppelins. This included regularly scheduled transatlantic service until the late 1930s when he served on the very famous Zeppelin, the Hindenburg. Kubis was a professional waiter. He had worked in luxury hotels all around the world, and when he first started working on Zeppelins, he actually worked alone, but once Zeppelins were large enough to accommodate about 20 passengers, Kubis needed help. So he was given an assistant steward and a cook was added to the crew. This continued to grow, and by the time he was serving on the 70-passenger Hindenburg, he was leading a team of 10 to 15 stewards and cooks. Now, just to give you an idea of the size, early Zeppelins were about a football field and a half in length, and they only went about 30 miles an hour. But when the Hindenburg came around, it was 3 football fields in length, and it could go up to 84 miles an hour. So there was plenty of room to serve meals in a lavish dining room, and that's exactly what Kubis was doing on May 6, 1937, when the ship burst into flames over New Jersey. He helped passengers down from the dining area, and since the Hindenburg was so low to the ground, he actually encouraged passengers and crew members to jump down from the window. So he was said to have acted very courageously while assisting others before he himself was also able to jump to safety without any injury. The Hindenburg tragedy ended the use of Zeppelins for passenger travel, and now we only see them like for advertising purposes, which I remember seeing them a lot as kids. They would like fly around the arena, like drop tickets to other events or something on the ground if you yelled loud enough. Do you guys remember that? That was probably like 20 something years ago, so maybe that's not even a thing anymore. Let me know in the comments down below. Is that still a thing? When commercial aviation began, most airline operators felt that the skies were really only for men, and in the 1920s, Imperial Airways in the UK started to recruit what they called cabin boys who would load luggage and reassure the passengers. Almost every source I was able to find named Ellen Church as the world's first stewardess, except one article that claimed the Germans actually added a female stewardess in 1928, and that was several years prior to Americans even deciding that women would be allowed to fly. So it could be more accurate to say that Ellen was the first stewardess in America, but regardless, it seems as though Ellen Church was the one who really kicked off the career as we know it today. So the story goes that Ellen wanted to be a doctor, but since that was more of a man's job in those days, her parents discouraged her from pursuing that path as it seemed unattainable for her as a woman. So instead, she became a nurse, and she moved from her small town in Iowa to the vibrant and exciting big city in San Francisco, where she began to work at a modern hospital. In her spare time, Ellen took flying lessons, and she actually obtained her pilot's license, which I was actually surprised to read. I didn't even realize that they let women do that back then. Ellen quickly made a name for herself among West Coast flyers hires and became one of the very few women to qualify in multi-engine aircraft. On her way home from working at the hospital, Ellen would walk past Boeing Air Transport, which was the predecessor for United Airlines. And one day, she actually decided to stop in and ask the office manager, Steve Simpson, for a job as a pilot. Steve immediately turns Ellen down. Apparently, he called the entire idea impossible and ludicrous. So Ellen decides to propose another idea. She suggested that the airline should hire flight nurses and put them on board their planes as a way of reassuring nervous public that flying was safe. She shrewdly pitched this idea as a public relations ploy. And at that time, Boeing was actually really struggling to attract passengers other than just a few random adventurers. And they desperately needed to supplement the revenue that they were getting from their main income stream, which was carrying the mail. But planes at that time were still very clumsy, and they actually fell out of the sky with alarming regularity. And planes were also at the mercy of unpredictable weather, which made flying not only scary and dangerous, but also inconvenient. So Steve, he agrees that this sounds like a great idea, but they had to convince headquarters. Apparently back in those days, the co-pilot would actually have to leave his controls and go back to the cabin to care for the passengers. He would hand out their box lunches and take care of anybody who became frightened or airsick. Now, airsickness was a lot more common back in those days because planes only flew at an altitude of 5,000 feet. And at that altitude, the air is extremely rough and bumpy. So this was really a regular problem that people were getting sick. And you can probably imagine that the rough air was very alarming for first-time travelers, and they probably really wanted a lot more assurance than the co-pilot had time for. So having a stewardess on board would really be great to free up the co-pilot to do his actual job, which I would argue is extremely important and not to be neglected. Add this all to the fact that women are typically more nurturing by nature and that people respect nurses and trust them more with their health and physical safety. All of this added up to a win-win. So Steve and Ellen work together on this plan, and they're able to convince the airline that it was worth a trial run at least. Boeing agreed to give Ellen's plan a 3-month trial, making her the head stewardess and tasking her with finding 7 other nurses to work on the planes. Now, this job paid really well, and so Ellen had no problem finding 7 other nurses in a time when the average pay for a nurse was about $20 a week. This job was offering $125 a month. Now, this is really a fortune if you compare it to other jobs that young females could get during the Great Depression, which was like being a shop girl or something like that. Those jobs paid less than $10 a week. So Boeing laid out the requirements for who she could hire. And firstly, they had to be a nurse. They couldn't be any more than 5 foot 4 inches tall, and they couldn't weigh more than 115 pounds. Now, a lot of times you see this told like it was some type of sexist act against women, but at this time, those requirements were actually put in place purely for practical reasons. In those days of early passenger planes, airlines actually had to count things down to the ounce. And for every additional pound that a crew member had on them, you would have to subtract that weight from something profitable like a pound of mail or the amount of passengers they could have or luggage or whatever freight they might be carrying. And in addition to that, these early planes had extremely narrow aisles and very low ceilings, and the stewardesses needed to be able to stand up and move around as freely as possible in these cramped spaces in order to adequately do their jobs. I don't know about you, but I'd rather be told I was too fat than to be the cause of like an entire airplane falling out of the sky, but that's just me. Additional requirements were that women had to be younger than 25 years old and unmarried. Now, I'm not sure about the age requirement thing, but my guess is that they wanted unmarried women so they wouldn't have to worry about like anxious husbands, or maybe they were just concerned with employees having the possibility of getting pregnant or something like that. Regardless, Ellen and her 7 nurses, who were advertised by BAT as Sky Girls, worked hard to prove that women could handle this job. They cared for airsick and frightened passengers. They took tickets, served coffee and hot soup. They cleaned inside the plane and even tightened the bolts that were holding the seats down. And in addition to all of that, they also took on all the menial tasks that had previously been assigned to the co-pilots. As I mentioned earlier, Ellen actually sold that to the airlines as a like selling point for the nurses is that they could relieve the co-pilot of a lot of these duties, and that also included loading and unloading luggage, fueling the plane, and even helping to push the planes in and out of hangars. Now, because the men were able to immediately see how much help these women were, how much they were taking off their plate, it actually helped to smooth over the transition, because previous to this, a lot of the pilots were really in opposition of having women crew members, but it didn't take long for them to see, man, this is nice. And it also kind of elevated the status of the co-pilot. Now they could just pretend they were above those menial tasks that they had passed off to the women. So Ellen and her Sky Girls were split into two groups, and they were working different routes. The one that Ellen was on was kind of like a double route, and it was a grueling 20-hour flight that went from San Francisco to Cheyenne, Wyoming, and then to Chicago. It was carrying 14 passengers, and it made 13 scheduled stops. I can't even imagine stopping that many times in a car for a 20-hour trip. That sounds terrible. Once they reached Chicago, Ellen was greeted by newspaper photographers and newsreel cameras. She was an instant celebrity, and having these Sky Girls on board the planes really did boost the sales for the airline, as Ellen had predicted. The experiment was declared a success, and all 8 women were hired permanently, with Ellen staying on as the chief stewardess. The newly reorganized United Airlines began hiring more stewardesses as fast as they could get them, and competing airlines were quick to do the same. Stewardess uniforms at this time were very conservative, with a white blouse, a skirt, a jacket, and a little hat. In just 3 years' time, the movie Air Hostess became the first movie featuring a romance between a pilot and a stewardess. It was a B movie, but it set the pattern for many more to come. By this time, Ellen's career as a stewardess was already over. After just 18 months in the air, she was grounded by injuries she received in an automobile accident. She returned to school and earned a BA in nursing, which was actually a level of training that only a very small minority of working RNs had at that time. By 1936, she was supervisor of pediatrics at Milwaukee County Hospital. As World War II began ramping up, nurses began being pulled away from stewardess jobs and into the armed forces. This resulted in airlines dropping the requirement for stewardesses to be nurses. As for Ellen, she left her job at the hospital and voluntarily joined the Army Nurse Corps. She helped to evacuate wounded soldiers from Africa and Italy by airplane and rose to the rank of captain. Because of her experience working in hospitals and organizing the stewardesses, Captain Ellen Church was called to train evacuation nurses for the D-Day invasion of France in 1944. In honor of her contributions during the war, Ellen received the Air Medal, the European, African, Middle Eastern Campaign Medal with 7 Bronze Service Stars, the American Theater Campaign Medal, and the Victory Medal. After the war, Ellen became the director of nursing and later the administrator of Union Hospital in Indiana. She continued flying as a private pilot and led a full active and athletic life. In 1964, at the age of 60 years old, she married for the first and only time. Less than a year later, on August 22nd, 1965, Ellen Church died of injuries in a horseback riding fall. She left no children, but is considered the spiritual mother of flight attendants everywhere. After World War II ended in 1945, the advances in military technologies, such as cabin pressurization, were applied to commercial airliners, and these new planes were faster, more comfortable, and carried more passengers. Though stewardesses no longer needed to be nurses, airlines still only accepted young, unmarried females, and there was a big emphasis on appearance. It was said that if a stewardess were to be married, she would be immediately fired, but it seems as though it was generally more like, if you wanted to get married, you were just expected to resign. The girls were also expected to be retired by the age of 30 to 32. The uniforms at this time were still relatively conservative, with hats, high heels, and white gloves, but they started to become more form-fitting during and after the war, which some say was because of the lack of material due to wartime shortages, but others say that was really just because the uniforms were following along with high fashion, which it could be argued that high fashion was also influenced by the lack of materials. Regardless, stewardesses' uniforms at this time were as glamorous as ever. Before the 1950s, to fit into the rigid beauty standard in the United States, stewardesses had to be white. A young African-American nurse named Ruth Carroll Taylor started to push back against this discriminatory practice in 1957 when she applied to be a flight attendant at TWA. The airline turned her down for the job, and and she countered by filing a complaint with New York State Commission on Discrimination. But then she heard that Mohawk Airlines was actually looking to hire African American women as stewardesses, so she applied there. She was chosen from a pool of over 800 applicants and became the first African American stewardess on April 11th, 1958. 3 months later, TWA hired Margaret Grant as the first Black stewardess for a major U.S. airline. Ruth had successfully broken the barrier. She's like, "You're welcome, Margaret." Ruth admitted that she actually had no long-term career aspirations as a flight attendant, but merely wanted to break the color barrier. 6 months later, Ruth married and was forced to resign from Mohawk due to restrictions that flight attendants must remain single. Throughout the 50s and 60s, being an air hostess or air stewardess was seen as a very elite profession. Flying was thought of as a ritzy experience and inspired things like Frank Sinatra's 1958 album Come Fly With Me, where Frank is on the cover beckoning you to get on his plane. Side note, apparently Frank had a bad reputation of being like a terrible flyer among the stewardesses who served him.
Frank Sinatra in particular, who was a very difficult passenger, very difficult.
This time between the 50s and 70s was considered the golden age of flying, and you really started to have what was called mass aviation, where planes got a lot safer and the experience of flying became a lot more common. Jetliners captured the public's imagination, and in the 1960s, new airports were popping up all over the place. But air travel was still extremely expensive, and it was merely aspirational for most people. The average American was more likely to put their suitcase in the back of their trunk and hit the road on one of the newly paved freeways. When you look back at the glamorous photos and dream of times gone past, you must remember those elite experiences also came with elite prices. And when you look back at ticket costs during that time, you probably wouldn't be flying at all. While there were some incredible comforts during that time, such as multi-course meals and larger spacious seats, a standard economy ticket would cost you anywhere from $1,000 to $1,500 in today's dollars. In the late 1960s, the fashion started to change with the times, and mini skirts and hot pants became uniform. In 60s fashion, anything was possible. A lot of colors, a lot of different patterns, a psychedelic prints, blouses with flowers or stripes and belts. And during this time, the airlines really started to use the air stewardess's image to promote their airlines to mostly male passengers who were traveling for business, selling a provocative and promiscuous look. Being a stewardess was a highly sought after job, and very few women who applied actually got the job. In 1967, some airlines boasted a lower acceptance rate than Harvard, accepting only 3% of their applicants. It was a position as coveted and competitive as becoming a model or a pageant winner.
They were on the same plane from a male perspective as actresses and models.
Well, I don't know how to explain glamour, but you could do anything you want. There were so many people asking you out.
The narrative was that being hired as a flight attendant validated your beauty and poise, and as a reward, you got to travel the world. The requirements to become a stewardess didn't change much from the 30s to the 60s, though they were now given a range of heights and weights as opposed to having to stay under a specific number. A 1966 New York Times classified ad listed the qualifications for a flight attendant job. It said you had to be a high school graduate, you had to be single, but they were willing to consider widows and divorcees as long as they had no children. You had to be 20 years of age. You needed to be between 5'2" and 5'9", and that your weight had to be proportionate to your height between 105 to 135. And you needed to have at least 20/40 vision without glasses. Some people have said that you basically had to be like Miss Universe or Miss World to be able to get one of these jobs, and the girls who were hired were considered extremely fortunate. They lived this glamorous life because only a few people were able to fly at that time, and flying was really something special back then. These girls really lived a life that a lot of people dreamed about. Because no one tried to hide the fact that flight attendants were there to basically be eye candy, big designers started having a lot of fun dressing them up and coming up with sexy new gimmicks to promote air travel. In 1968, Jean Lewis gave United Airlines stewardesses a simple mod A-line dress and a wide stripe down the front and around the collar, and the designer paired it with with a big blocky cap. During the 60s and 70s, Pucci designed 5 different uniforms for Banff International Airways, and the Pucci uniforms actually even came with like a space helmet that was like this plastic bubble that was put on their head, and it was used to keep the rain from messing up your hair. Now, a couple of these uniforms are cool looking, but some of these, like this one, I think is extremely embarrassing. Some of them were downright unprofessional. I don't know about wearing that at work. Banff also had something called the airstrip in 1965. This was like during service, which is, you know, what they call the flight. The stewardesses would take something off to reveal like a different layer, a different outfit underneath. So they might have like a skirt on, and then they would take it off to show that they were wearing only hot pants underneath, which if you guys are not familiar with that term, it's kind of an old-timey person term. It's like what my generation would call Daisy Dukes. You guys would probably just call them shorts, but I would still call them like booty shorts. If you're watching this, you can see the pictures I'm putting up. In case you're too young to know what hot pants are, that's what they are. They're not pants. They're very short shorts. Around this time is when the stewardess image reached the height of its sexualization, becoming a collective cultural fantasy thanks to the airlines shamelessly promoting them in their advertising. Now, the dark side to all of this is that it really started to lead to the stewardesses getting sexually harassed, especially when it came to drunken passengers. A lot of them reported that they were pinched, propositioned, all the things while they were working, but it was all being promoted and basically caused by this advertising message that the airlines were putting out there. And the gimmicks just kept getting worse during this time, I'm assuming because it was working so well. And the airlines, I guess they just didn't know when to stop. At one point, TWA gave the stewardesses paper dresses to wear as their uniform, and they were supposed to reflect the regional cuisine that was being served on board. The 4 styles they had included the British wench, a French cocktail, Roman toga, and Manhattan penthouse pajamas. And these dresses were made up of a fabric-like paper, and it said that it was just a little tougher than the paper that you actually write on. They were disposable dresses that the flight attendants could only wear once or twice, and some of the flight attendants actually complained that passengers would burn their dresses with cigarettes, or they'd even attempt to like dissolve the dresses by splashing alcohol or water or something on them, which sounds so terrible. But again, it was basically encouraged by the airlines. They heavily marketed their stewardesses as sex symbols to get men to fly with them, and some of them were reported to have even passed out little black books for men to try and like get the stewardess's phone number. So like when men are boarding the plane, they're like, here, try to get her number, try to get her number. Like, so bad. Look, I'm just gonna say, not all male attention is bad. Men were created to be attracted to women. It's only natural. Many of us women do find it flattering when we receive male attention, but only to a point. Don't ever be putting your hands on someone that you're not in a romantic relationship with. That's not flattering or encouraged in any way, ever. I would think that men in our current day and age mostly know how to act. But if you don't know the difference between flirting and harassment, I'm gonna help you out. It basically just comes down to if a woman is into you or not. If she likes you, she's gonna think it's cute. If she doesn't, she's gonna think it's creepy. Maybe it's not fair. But I will tell you guys, in general, if someone is at work, they probably aren't wanting that kind of attention. Now, unless they're really giving it back to you. I'm just saying nervous laughter doesn't count as somebody being into you. So some of y'all just need to learn to read a room. Obviously, these just weren't normal situations or interactions. We really do have the airline to blame because I feel like some of the advertising almost made these men feel like they were getting on the plane to find a girlfriend or a wife. It was almost like they thought buying a ticket was a setup. That's kind of how the advertising was. So even though I don't think any of these men should ever put their hands on women, it's like they were being set up on a blind date, proposed to them like these women wanted to be with them.
Well, a stew bum would be considered somebody who was a little bit creepy and obsessive, only wanted to date stewardesses, probably thinking, as many of them did, that the airlines had already gone through the screening process, so if they wanted to get a girlfriend or a wife, this was the most efficient way to do it.
A lot of our male passengers were out to find a wife and were, if not a wife, certainly someone to date. We had a lot of that, and we enjoyed it, of course.
By the early 70s, air travel meant futuristic glamour. Famous designers and artists were recruited to construct a modernist look for the airplanes, from the logos and stewardess uniforms all the way down to the airport interiors and even the planes and the fuel trucks on the ramp. People who were wealthy enough to pay for a flight got to enjoy a posh experience in the air, and first class passengers might even enjoy cozy onboard beds, luxury meals, or even live piano performances. And in addition to all of this, passengers were waited on hand and foot by gorgeous female flight attendants dolled up in a smart, fashionable outfit. Probably one of the most outrageous examples of airlines directly marketing flight attendants in a sexual way was when National Airlines spent $9.5 million on a 1971 campaign that read, "I'm Cheryl, fly me."
Everything you've heard about us Miami girls is true. We're always on the move. I'm Judy, and I was born to fly. National has non-stop DC-10s every day. You can fly me morning, afternoon, or night. Just say when.
National later expanded the ads to include, "I'm going to fly you as you've never been flown before." I feel like airlines were like nightclubs back in these days. No wonder guys thought they were going to go on a plane and get a date. Guys are setting them up.
I'm Diane. I've got 747s to Miami. Fly me. I'm Terry. I've got great connections in Miami, all over the Sunshine States of America. Fly me.
I'm Marisa. I've got non-stop flights to Miami every day. Fly me.
They were setting you guys up back then. Some people were outraged at National because of this campaign, but National claimed they saw a 23% bump in passenger traffic as a result. Sex sells, and they were like, dollar bills, y'all. Luckily, such whimsy didn't last long. Up until this point in the United States, government regulations set the price of tickets and the routes. Deregulation of the airline industry in the mid-1970s caused the price of airline tickets to drop, and new bargain airlines like People Express and Southwest Airlines joined the market. As a result, more and more people were able to fly, but the luxury perks of air travel and goofy stunts like paper dresses as uniforms were some of the first things to get the axe. Around the same time, the women who worked as stewardesses in the United States were starting to get fed up with the whole charade, and they organized the Stewardesses for Women's Rights group in 1972. And after a bunch of strikes, Title VII lawsuits, and campaigns, stewardesses protesting their exploitation and demanded to be taken seriously as professionals, including better pay and benefits, and fighting against discrimination based on their sex, beauty, or age. And all of this led to better compensation for flight attendants, looser restrictions on age and weight, and even men joining the ranks. This progress meant the end of the tiny, colorful shift dresses, which were replaced by professional-looking suits with skirts that went past the knee in earthy tones. In the 1970s and 80s, some airlines like American, United, and Western maintained a bit of playfulness in their costumes, and so if they were having flights to like Hawaii or Tahiti, flight attendants would have a separate type of outfit. People would say that it was always nice to fly to Hawaii. They loved seeing the cabin crew all dressed up in their Hawaiian gear, and they just really felt like it set the mood for the vacation or just a different atmosphere on the way there. But most airlines have dropped that practice just because it was too expensive to keep doing it. From the 1980s and onwards, airlines adapted a more professional business-style look for their flight attendant uniforms, and the dress code became more functional. The role of the flight attendant had slightly changed in that they were regarded in terms of safety, not just service or appearance. And in 1990, President George H.W. Bush acknowledged the profession by making July 19th Flight Attendant Safety Professionals Day. Appearance and image is still a very important factor for many airlines, and airlines have dropped the discriminatory rules for employees. Weight regulations are no longer needed, and so those were dropped in the late 1990s. And by the early 2000s, female cabin crew could actually wait and retire at a more actual retirement age instead of being forced out at 32. Uniforms are still important, but they're now tested for functionality and have adapted more of a gender neutral approach. I know that some airlines even have like multiple outfits. You can choose if you want to wear like a dress or a skirt or pants. I know every time I fly, I usually see a mix which just all coordinates. It's like the same color scheme, which I think personally looks very professional. Some airlines are even now allowing employees to have visible tattoos. Of course, after 9/11 in 2001, things changed massively, and the tougher safety regulations have meant that the flight attendant's job is a lot more difficult than it used to be. And the modern name for the profession is cabin crew. They're kind of all called that. And this is seen as a title that reflects safety as a top priority. And then of course you have everything that happened in 2020, which has created a lot more challenges for this industry, with many cabin crew losing their jobs when planes were not allowed to fly, and some of them actually never returned to the industry. And following a period of travel chaos where no one was able to fly and then everybody was trying to fly all at once, this has really caused disruptive passenger incidences to rise quite remarkably. You've probably heard about a little of that. And now even more recently, we're seeing in 2023 a lot of grounded planes due to computer problems, which sounds fishy to me. What started out as a really high paying job is now something that starts out at really pretty low paying. For many currently working as flight attendants, the hours are longer, but if the last 9 decades have taught us anything, it's that this role will continue to evolve, and many still choose this career path as a way to see the world and live a life full of adventure. Luckily, airlines have realized over the last several decades that flight attendant uniforms should be professional, and that hot pants and go-go boots are not really professional at all. Some airlines have even loosened up their flight attendant dress code from professional to casual, with polo shirts, baseball caps, and baggy nylon shorts as uniforms, which seems to work for the low budget airlines. That customer base really doesn't care about much other than the price, getting there safely and on time. Though some fashion lovers miss the vibrant colors of the 60s and 70s and lament that airlines now seem to be afraid to use colors, with most uniforms being navy blue, they miss the personality of those days when stewardess uniforms set the fashion standards, and they complain they can't even tell the airlines apart until you get close enough to see the wings on their jackets. I, for one, am glad that flight attendants have come full circle and are now back to being regarded as the safety professionals that they are. I read a very interesting comment from a woman named Kathy, who was on a blog detailing the uniforms and advertising slogans over the decades for airlines, and she said that she distinctly remembers reading a joke in Reader's Digest sometime in the 70s. It was during a period of time when United Airlines was having their stewardesses wear mini skirts, and their new slogan was gonna be "Fly the friendly thighs of United." Kathy said, "We've come a long way, baby." I'd have to agree with Kathy. Nowadays, we have people who kind of like to pretend that we haven't made progress over the years. But to that I say, we've come a long way, baby. Thanks for watching today's video. YouTube thinks you'll like this video right here, so go ahead and watch it.